Should I close the door? Oh, excuse me. You got it? Well, did I get a nap this afternoon? I'm tired. I did not get a nap. No. When your kids get older like your kids, do you get one? That is something. You can't? Oh man, that's sad. Very sad. All right, everybody. Good evening to you all. We're just waiting on Bruce McKinney. I'm just kidding. Good to see all you guys. Looking forward to talking about what we're going to talk about in class tonight. I hope you read Genesis chapter 26 because I determined that was, in fact, the chapter that I had wanted you to read. And I apologize for that scheduling snafu. Before we get going tonight, which should be really fun because we're going to talk about this question first, we're going to have Tyler Nerlin lead us in an opening prayer. Amen. Amen. Appreciate that. All right, we're going to talk about Genesis 26 tonight, but in order to do that, we're going to start in Genesis 23. So go ahead and turn to Genesis 23. We're going to use that chapter to kind of introduce an idea, to talk about a story that we often don't talk about, hardly ever, when we discuss the book of Genesis, but it should be useful in proving our point. But before we go anywhere, let's ask this question. And you can apply this to grandkids if you feel like you're too old and your kids are already married. So, what are some red flags that you're going to tell your kids to watch out for when they begin dating, right? So you want your son, you want your daughter to marry someone who's really good. And so here's something that you tell them, okay, if you find somebody who's like this, run the other direction. Okay, watch how he treats his mother for the girls. All right. Yes. Okay, wolf in sheep's clothing. No context for that. Just, all right. That's all you're going to say. All right, very good. You'll have to riddle that out. Yes, ma'am. Okay. Yeah, okay. So how they look at somebody who may be in a subservient position to them, notice how they treat that person, and that tells you a lot about them. Yeah. Okay, make sure they have a good work ethic, because that would be really, really miserable to marry someone who's really lazy. That's definitely true. Yes, sir. Okay. So this is actually very, very good advice. Make sure that you are with other people when you're dating, not get yourself into a tempting situation. I like that advice. Same advice my dad gave to me. That was ignored. That's just, but didn't we all? Anyway, any other advice? Red flags to watch out for when you're dating. What? They're bad with money. Okay. Oh, here we go. So, specifically, what does bad with money mean? I'm just kidding. But that is something to watch out for, right? Make sure that they can say no to themselves, that they're not going to, spend into oblivion and get themselves a bunch of debt, because that might make life miserable. All right? Anything else? What are you going to tell your kids to watch out for when they go out and they start dating? Yes, sir. Stay away from a girl that wears too much makeup. All right, all right. What's the idea behind that, Joe? You don't have to if you don't want to. There is something to that, though, right? You want to look and make sure whether makeup is a good gauge of that. You do want to watch for vanity, right? Are they really somebody who's a substantive person, or are they just kind of surface level? You know, one of the things that we like to say is that you shouldn't judge people. And we also like to say that you can't judge a book by its cover. And those things are true, but only to an extent, right? That there is a degree to which we do need to judge people. We do need to be discerning when it comes to who we get involved with, right? Whether that, excuse me, whether that means we're dating somebody or whether that means we're going to get involved in business with somebody. There's some judgment that needs to be made, some discernment that needs to be made. When we look at that person, we need to be able to make a judgment about them. And so it is possible, despite what popular wisdom says, to use discernment, to use observation, to know somebody and kind of understand what kind of person they are. You can actually tell a lot about a person by watching how they carry themselves, by watching how they use their money, watching how they treat waiters and waitresses and people who are serving them. You can learn a lot by observing somebody and the way they live their life. Now, what I want you to know is that the book of Genesis teaches us that the world is observing the people who walk with God. That people are also looking at us, and they can tell a lot about us. Even though everybody in the world says, don't judge, guess what they're doing? They're judging us, especially these days, and especially people who claim to be Christians. And so one of the things that I want you to notice as we trace our way through these stories, as we look at the family of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, as they walk by faith, as they wait for the promises, one thing that we see in the book of Genesis is that the world is watching them, and the world can tell what kind of people they are. Even though they may not be in their family and they may not live their day-by-day life with them, the worldly people, they know who they are and they can tell what kind of people they are. They're lights, even all the way back here in Genesis, and even though they're such a small family living in this land. Now, to make that point, we have to go to Genesis chapter 23, which you guys are already there. But here's a very interesting story about the burial of Sarah. Again, who's talked about this in a Bible class before? I know that I hadn't until I wrote the class. Genesis 23, beginning in verse 1. Does someone want to read verses 1 through 20 to save my voice? There's a whole chapter.
Sarah lived 127 years. The years of the life of Sarah. Sarah died at Kiriath-arba, which is Sidon, in the land of Canaan, and Abraham went in to mourn for Sarah and to weep for her. And Abraham rose up from before his dead and said to the Hittites, I am a sojourner and a foreigner among you. Give me property among you for burying place, that I may bury my dead out of my sight. The Hittites answered Abraham, Hear us, my lord. You are a prince of God among us. Bury your dead in the choicest of our tombs. None of us will withhold from you his tomb to hinder you from burying your dead. Abraham rose and bowed to the Hittites, the people of the land. And he said to them, If you are willing that I should bury my dead out of my sight, hear me and entreat Ephron, the son of Zohar, so that he may give me the cave of Machpelah, which he owns. It is a field of his field. For the price, let him give it to me in your presence as property for a burying place. Now Ephron was sitting among the Hittites, and Ephron the Hittite answered Abraham in the hearing of the Hittites. Of all who went into the gate of the city, No, my lord, hear me. I give you the field, and I give you the cave that is in it. In the sight of the sons of my people, I give it to you. Down before Ephron, people give the price of the field. Accept it from me, bury my dead with it. Ephron answered Abraham, My lord, listen to me. A piece of land worth. What is that between you and me? Bury your dead. Listen to Ephron, and Abraham weighed out for Ephron the silver that he had named in the hearing of the Hittites, 400 shekels of silver, according to the weights among the current workers. So the field of Ephron was in Machpelah, which was to the east of Mamre. the field with the cave that was in it, and all the trees that were in the field, throughout its whole area, was made over to Abraham as a possession in the presence of the Hittites, before all who went into the gate of his city. After this, Abraham buried Sarah his wife in the cave of Machpelah, east of Mamre, that is Hebron, in the land of Canaan. The field and the cave that is in it were made over to Abraham as a property for a burial place and habitation.
All right. Now, this may seem like a really just kind of weird story. This is just the burial of Sarah. What kind of application would this have? But there's some interesting things that happen in here. And really, it's an interesting story about faith. So Abraham is here. He's living in the land of Canaan. And he's got an interesting predicament when his wife dies. What's his predicament? He doesn't own anything, right? Which is not something we think about. We think back into those days. We think everybody lives in the wilderness, just find some ground and bury somebody. But this is a problem for him because nothing belongs to him. And so where's he supposed to bury his wife? And ultimately, he's thinking, where are they going to bury me? He's trying to find a proper burial place, not just some unmarked grave. He wants to establish something here by burying his wife where he will be buried and the rest of his family will be buried. But he's got a problem because he doesn't own any land. So in verse 6, the Hittites, they offer up one of their graves to let Abraham use what belongs to them. And then there comes that little interesting thing where this often happens when an older couple who makes more money than you because you're a young person invites you out to lunch, and they're like, hey, we'll cover your check. And you're like, no, I got it. And they're like, no, we'll cover your check. And you're like, no, seriously, I'll pay for it. And then you do that back and forth thing, hoping the whole time that they really will actually take care of it. Y'all are laughing because you know it's true. So that's what happens. Abraham says, no, I'm going to pay for it. And Ephron says, no, you take it. Abraham says, no, I'm really going to pay for it. And Ephron says, okay, whatever. 400 shekels of silver. What do you think is the point of all of that? Is this just two guys being nice to each other? Or is there something deeper to this? Yes, ma'am.
Go back to verse 5. He was looking at God's chosen one. So they knew that he was there. They knew that there was something special about him and his relationship with God.
Yeah, absolutely. So yours says he was God's chosen one. Mine says you are a prince of God among us, which I like. I like that language too. Yes, sir. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Yes, sir. Yeah. Oh, that's interesting, right? Right? Because 400 shekels, it seems, based on what Ephron is saying, is not a lot of money. I could be wrong with that, Jonathan.
I've read that it's exorbitant amount of money.
Oh,
Yeah.
all right.
He's like, oh, what is that? It's nothing here. It's 400 shekels. Like, that's how much it's worth, and that's way above what
So is that like me saying, oh, $10,000? What's
Yeah,
that? Okay. Maybe that's what's going on here, yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So there's two ways of looking at this, really. One way is that they look at him and say, hey, you're a wonderful guy, and so we're just going to give it to you for free. And he says, no, I'm a man of character. I want to buy, right? I want to buy this and use it for this reason. And that could certainly be what's happening. There's another way of looking at it, too, though, and it's a little bit more devious and mischievous. And it could be that what the Hittites are actually trying to do is they're trying to make sure that Abraham and his family don't actually own anything in the land. So think about this at this point. They're saying, hey, you can use our grave, but who is it still going to belong to? It's still going to belong to them. And for the rest of time, it's still going to belong to him. Abraham may bury his family there, but who does it belong to? It still belongs to the Hittites. And so it could be that Abraham is pressing this because what he really wants is he wants a possession. He wants to actually stake his claim in the promised land and say, here's a portion of this land that actually belongs to us. And it could be both of those things at the same time. I did write down 2 Samuel 24 because that's the idea. This is a special thing, and he's not going to take it for free. And so it could be that he wants to honor the people. It could be that he wants to honor Sarah. But it's also very likely that what Abraham is doing here is he is staking his claim on the promised land. And so I want you to appreciate that that's a demonstration of faith. that he knows that one day his descendants will own this land, and he wants them to know that they have a portion in this land. He wants his wife to be buried here. He wants his family to be buried here. He doesn't want his bones to be brought back to his own homeland and buried there. He wants his descendants to be here, and he wants to actually own it because that's what God promised. Now, does that remind you of anybody else in the Bible story? Somebody who cares about where they're buried? Yeah, I'm not going to step on your husband's toes too much, Miss Sandy, but yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. That's what Joseph says, right? When he dies in Egypt, he says, when you guys leave, I want you to take up my bones, I want you to carry them to the promised land, and I want you to bury me there. And if you look, that's exactly what they do in Joshua 24 and verse 32. They bury the bones of Joseph all those years later. They took him home. And so I think that's a really cool story. In one of the later classes, we're going to talk a little bit more about the Cave of Machpelah and living with hope and what all that means. But I really did want to focus here, now that we kind of understand what's going on in this story, on that language that's used in verse 5 that Miss Kathy referenced at the very beginning, where the Hittites respond to Abraham and they say, listen to us, my Lord, you are a prince of God among us. And so what I want you to appreciate is that the Hittites look at Abraham and, and they recognize that there's something special about him. That he is a unique kind of man. They don't treat him the same way they treat other foreigners. And, well, maybe it's possible they treat everyone this way. But I have a hard time believing that every single person that they came up to, they said, you're a prince of God among us, no matter who they were or where they were from. There was something, and it's indicated by that language, something different about Abraham, something special about him. And they use that term, you're a prince of God. What did your translation use, Miss Kathy? You are God's chosen one among us. Anyone have a different translation, different words used there? What? Mighty prince? Yeah. Mighty prince, you are God's chosen one. You are a prince of God. What do those terms indicate they understood about Abraham? He had a position that was important, certainly. He's blessed, okay? And what does the word blessed imply? That you're blessed by someone, right? And so there's something about him that they recognize, hey, you've got something together with God, right? You have a relationship with God, and everybody seems to be able to recognize that about him. What else? That idea, those words, that title, what's that say about Abraham? Yeah, absolutely. Well respected. That obviously would have been because of God and the way that God was leading him and the things God had told him to do. What else? Yeah, I think that's something special too, right? The idea that he is not just a good person, not just a moral person, he is a spiritual person, right? And you see that in Abraham and a lot of stuff that he does. Wherever he goes, what does he build? He builds altars, right? And so people look at him and recognize you're not just some regular person. You're not just some regular person who digs wells or builds towers or fights wars. You're a person who builds altars. And that means you are a spiritual person. You are a person who is interested in godly things, in things that are above this world. They recognize all of that about Abraham by the way he lives his life. One thing that I want you to appreciate is that these people, even though they are probably polygamist or atheist or whatever they are, all sorts of different things surely, they recognize something special about Abraham. He is a prince of God among them. And we see that that's true, and that theme kind of runs itself through all of Genesis. If you turn back a little bit, in Genesis 21, Genesis chapter 21, verses 22 through 23, you see Abraham's covenant with Abimelech. And even though he's lied to the guy, listen to what it says. At that time, Abimelech, accompanied by Michael, the commander of his army, said to Abraham, God is with you in everything you do. Swear to me by God here and now that you will not break an agreement with me or with my children and descendants. As I have been loyal to you, so you will be loyal to me and to the country where you are a resident alien, all right? And so we see back there in chapter 21, he says, we see, we understand, we notice that God is with you in everything you do. Now go forward in Genesis chapter 26. Genesis chapter 26, and look at what's said, not about Abraham, but about his son Isaac. Genesis 26, beginning in verse 26, The Bible says this, Now Abimelech came to him from Gerar with Ahuzath, his advisor, and Phicol, the commander of his army. Isaac said to him, Why have you come to me? You hated me and sent me away from you. They replied, We have clearly seen how the Lord has been with you. We think there should be an oath between two parties, between us and you. Let us make a covenant with you. So they see that in Abraham, and then years later they see that in his son Isaac as well. Look at what it says in Genesis chapter 30. Go forward a little bit. Genesis chapter 30 in verse 27. Genesis 30 in verse 27. Listen to what Laban says to Jacob, not Abraham or Isaac, but now to Jacob. But Laban said to him, If I have found favor with you, stay. I have learned by divination. The Lord has blessed me because of you. So Jacob said to him, I skipped. Then Laban said, Name your wages and I will pay them. There it is. And so you see that Laban recognizes that about Jacob now. Now turn once more to Genesis chapter 39. Genesis chapter 39, this is after Joseph has been kidnapped and taken into Egypt, and now he is a servant in Potiphar's house. And do you remember what it says about him there when he was serving? Verse 2. The Lord was with Joseph, and he became a successful man, serving in the household of his Egyptian master. When his master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord made everything he did successful, Joseph found favor with his master, became his personal attendant. Potiphar also put him in charge of his household and placed all that he owned under his authority. So you see this is a theme that runs through the book of Genesis. That these people who walk with God, the people who are around them notice that. They understand there's something special about them. They are princes of God among us. We see that God is with you. We understand that God has blessed us because you are among us. One of the things that we said when we got into this second portion of Genesis, after chapter 11, we're going to talk about Abraham and his family and what it means to walk with God and what it means to live by faith. And this is one of the things that seems very, very clear, that people who walk with God, the world notices that. At least the world ought to notice that. That the same that is said of them should be said of us, that you are a prince of God among us, that we recognize that God is with you. They should be able to see that we have character, that we are spiritual people, that we are the kind of people like Abraham who do what? Who build altars instead of just focusing on physical pursuits. Now, we could make that point from the life story of any of those four men, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, or Joseph. But I want to focus in on Genesis chapter 26 and talk about how Isaac was a light. We read a little bit about that just a few verses ago, but I want you to go back there with me. And the reason I want to do this is because I really don't feel like Isaac gets that much press. Usually when we talk about Isaac, we are talking about how Isaac plays into the story of either his father, right, in Genesis 22, or how he plays in the life of his son, like we talked about with Jacob and Esau. Isaac doesn't get that much press. We don't focus in on his life very much. But there is something significant that happens here in Genesis 26 that tells us a lot about Isaac and shows us how he was a light in the world he lived in. Someone read Genesis 26, 18 through 21, if you will. 18 through 31. Did I say that or did I say 21? So when you read through that story, without getting caught up in some of the Old Testament languagey stuff and the fact that we don't understand what it's like to quarrel over a well, if you can cut through all of that stuff, I find this a really impressive display by Isaac. Do you find that too? What really stands out to you about the way Isaac carries himself through this story? Okay, so he was unwilling to really contend over these wells, right? And so there's something peaceful about him, that he doesn't fight back in the same way, that when they start fighting over the wells, he's like, okay, I'll just move a little bit further on. What else? What else do you see in... Is that the way you would respond if you dug a well and somebody came and said, no, that's ours? Probably not, right? Probably not. Yeah, so there is something about him, again, that's peaceful, right? Not only does he move away when they begin quarreling, but when they come back and they change their minds, like, hey, let's be friends after we treated you awful, he's like, okay, let's eat together, have a banquet, and be friends. And so there's something peaceful in his nature, and I do like to see that in him. What else? Yes, ma'am. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Absolutely. Not only is the resource valuable, right? But how hard is it to dig a well? You think about that for a second, especially in ancient times. I'm just now thinking of this idea, but I should have researched how they build wells in Africa, right? You've seen those things where it's like, hey, spend for $4,000 you can build a well in Africa, and everybody in this village can have water. You know how much that costs and how much time that takes in our time with our resources? How long must it have taken Isaac to dig those wells? And it's kind of alluded to in that story, right? Where it talks about in verse 18, Isaac reopened the wells that had been dug in the days of his father Abraham that the Philistines had stopped up after Abraham died. How long have these wells been stopped up, right? And nobody, even though it was so precious, said, oh, let's go dig out those wells. That'll be easy. This is really hard work that he does. He puts a lot of time and investment into digging these wells and making this water available, and they just kick him off this land, and he goes. And that's pretty incredible to me. I think it's pretty impressive that he's willing to do that not once, but twice. And he ultimately ends up digging 3 wells. Yes, sir? Yeah, I would have done that. I would have done that. Now, it is in my nature to leave and say, okay, I'm not going to fight about this, I'll just go. But to feed them and put them up for a night after that, that's not in my nature. That'd be very difficult for me to do. Anything else you guys want to say about what Isaac does here? Yes, sir. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Yes, sir.
I guess one thing that's going on with Abraham, the whole group of them, is later on when Israel actually becomes a nation, the entire purpose of them is to be blessings to the nations around.
Mm-hmm.
And you see that happening now with their families, where a lot of these people are getting on good terms with them. Not so much because they really want to, but because you hang out around these guys, they have abundance, they have water. We are blessed by our association.
Yep.
And you see that with Abraham. You see it again here where they're like, well, we can fight these guys, and then, hey, we'll probably lose because Abraham has a pretty good record.
Yeah.
And then also we lose all this good stuff we have. And through God, through these people, the nations are being blessed around them, which leads up to what the Israelites are supposed to do later on.
Yeah. And I think that's exactly right. There were 3 things I wrote down in this story, ways in which Isaac distinguishes himself. The first way is he distinguishes himself by his efforts, right? He is willing to dig the wells that nobody else is willing to dig. He's willing to do that not just once, but he's willing to do it 3 times. He's willing to put forth that effort. And maybe that speaks to his faith too, right? Because as somebody who believes that your descendants are going to inherit this land, you want these wells to be there. Remember, where does Jesus meet the Samaritan woman? Whose well? Jacob's well. How long was that well there? Think about that, right? And so that might show faith that he's willing to dig these wells, but it also shows that he's distinguished by his efforts. He's also distinguished by his demeanor or his attitude, that he is a peaceful man, somebody who is willing to put away the bitterness, to put away the quarreling, and make peace with these people. But also, the third thing I said is he's distinguished by his fortunes. And the reason these people come back is not because they feel bad about what they did, but because they're jealous and they want some of the blessings that came from being so close to Isaac. And so we see that he distinguishes himself in this story. He sets himself apart. He's not like other people. He's not like other people. Yeah. Yeah. By the way, this is totally off the, well, maybe not totally off the subject, but it is indirect. But you bring up an important point, that as Christians, we ought to be the kind of people who dig other wells, right? We ought to be the kind of person who says, that didn't work out for me, but that's okay. Maybe God needs me somewhere else. And I'm not going to stop working. I'm not going to stop trying. I'm not going to stop putting forth effort just because that venture didn't work out. God is going to make something happen. He's going to put me where I need to be put. And so he shows us a little bit of faith in that, and we can learn something from that. Yes, sir, are you going to say something, or are you scratching your face? All right. So I want you to see that this is true of all these patriarchs, of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph. They all distinguish themselves. Whenever the people who are around them look at them, they notice that these men shine. And oftentimes it looks exactly like it did for Isaac. They are distinguished because of their efforts. They're willing to put in more work than other people. They're distinguished because of their attitudes. They have a better attitude, a more faith-filled attitude than other people do. I mean, just imagine if somebody else, somebody who's not Isaac, ends up experiencing the things that he experienced. What happens if some random guy, let's pick out a random guy from this story. What if the king of Sodom, right? Remember that guy from Genesis chapter 14? What do you think he does if these people come and try to kick him off his land? Yeah, I'm going to kill him, or we're going to go to war and I'm going to lose, because he probably would. And that's what would happen with somebody else, but not with these guys. They're different. They shine. They distinguish themselves. And I think we need to appreciate that as Christians. That's exactly the same way we are supposed to be. You might turn to Genesis chapter 34. Genesis 34 is one of my favorite stories in the book of Genesis that we're not really going to have time to cover, but who knows what happens in Genesis chapter 34. It's kind of a weird interlude. Y'all know this story? Yeah, Dinah is defiled. So what happens in the story? Someone give me Cliff's Notes. Oh, there's a controversy there, so maybe I shouldn't ask for Cliff Notes. So Dinah goes out, and one of two things happen, right? Either she wants to be a little bit worldly and does something she shouldn't do, or she was sexually assaulted. We're not quite sure based on the language which one it is. But anyway, what happens as a result of that is this young man in the land named Shechem, he becomes attached to her, and he wants to take her as a wife, and her brothers are fighting mad about what's happened to her. He's treated her like a harlot, and so what they do is they form this plot. Shechem and his father Hamor, they come to Abraham and Isaac and his family, Jacob and his family, and they want to get married, right? They want to form a marriage alliance with them, and so the sons say, you know what, Simeon and Levi, we'll let you marry her, but all your men have to be circumcised because we cannot be joined to people who are uncircumcised. So then the next day, they all go ahead and do that surgical procedure. And then while they're in their pain, Simeon and Levi come upon the city and they kill every single male in the city. Does that sound like something Isaac would do? Despite however you feel about what's happened to their sister, it's not a way that you distinguish yourself as a godly and a spiritual person in this world. Listen to what it says. Listen to what Jacob says to his sons Simeon and Levi when he finds out what they've done. Verse 30. Then Jacob said to Simeon and Levi, "You have brought trouble on me, making me odious to the inhabitants of the land, the Canaanites and the Perizzites. We are few in number. If they unite against me and attack me, I and my household will be destroyed." But they answered, "Should he treat our sister like a prostitute?" And so there we see Simeon and Levi acting different than how the other patriarchs act, right? That instead of distinguishing themselves, instead of being a prince of God among us, or we have seen that God is with you, they become these angry, vengeful, vindictive people. So much so that their dad says, "You've made me odious. I can't stay here because of the way that you're acting." And this is so vastly different from how the other patriarchs act, that's actually for this reason that Simeon and Levi are not the son through whom the promised line comes. That ultimately, when the seed of Abraham goes all the way through in Jesus doesn't come from Simeon or Levi, even though they were second and third in line. He comes from Judah, who was fourth in line, for this very reason. They did not distinguish themselves. They acted vengefully here. And so it's so important, and it's sending us this message that as Christians, we cannot live like the world. So it's always important to ask yourself the question, how do I live? And do I really shine like a light? If I were to encounter an episode like what Isaac experiences in Genesis 26, would I respond the way Isaac did? If I were to encounter a scenario like Joseph did in Genesis 39, where Potiphar's wife is coming after him, would I respond the way that he did? Am I the kind of person who distinguishes myself among the other people in the world? I wonder sometimes if we ask ourselves the question. Jesus asked the question in Matthew chapter 5, if you'll turn there. Matthew chapter 25. That's one of my favorite questions that Jesus asks in the Gospels. Matthew chapter 25, he says this in verse 26, "For if you love those who love you, what reward will you have? Do not even the tax collectors do the same? And if you greet only your brothers and sisters, what are you doing that's out of the ordinary? Do not even the Gentiles do the same? Be perfect, therefore, as your heavenly Father is perfect." And so one of the things that the point that Jesus is trying to get across there is that as people who are citizens of my kingdom, you need to hold yourself to a higher standard of behavior than everybody else. If you're the kind of person who just greets the people who greet you, if you're just nice to the people who are nice to you, what benefit is that, right? Who does that? Everybody does. And if you're somebody who only warmly greets your brothers, your kinsmen, then what's out of the ordinary about that? Everybody greets their kinsmen warmly. He says, in my kingdom, you're supposed to be different. In fact, earlier in that chapter, he would tell them just how different. Look at what it says in Matthew 5, that famous passage. Matthew 5, verses 13 through 16. Somebody read that for us. Matthew 5, 13 through 16. And that's what we're called to be. We're called to be salt and light in this world, just like Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and Joseph were in the land in which they lived. Now, somebody might say to that, it's not really easy to be a light shining in this world. Would you say that that's a difficult thing? What makes it so hard to shine as a light in this world? We don't want to be different, right? He tells us to be different, and I say, nah, I really don't want to be. That's true. Why don't we want to be different?
I think it's really hard. Here it's really easy to want to be friends with someone, but when we go out into the workplace and it's just us having to, spend our time, it can make us feel like maybe an exile, which is really what we're supposed to be.
Mm-hmm.
But we want to be part of that beforehand. Our community, we want to be part of the connection. And so I think it can be difficult when we don't go to happy hours with people who are even taking
Absolutely. What else? Yes, sir.
If you grow spiritually, you have faith, it's not difficult at all.
Okay.
You see the darkness with my job. I deal with people in the world every day. Their lives are miserable, completely miserable. You know?
Yeah.
It's not difficult at all. It's just the way they live.
All right. I wish I had more faith like Glenn. I'll tell you what. That's impressive, brother.
Outgoing in a way that people end up getting some degree of involvement. At the beginning, you know, lunch, coffee, and maybe doing great things together, including studying the Bible together, maybe helping someone become a Christian. That takes time. That's away from other things that we're really busy with. So I think the reality of it is that sometimes they unfortunately pull back.
Yeah, absolutely. So maybe that's one reason, is being really different requires a lot of our time. What else? Yes, ma'am. No, I think that's certainly true, and I think Jesus verifies that itself. That I tell myself, well, if I act like that, right? If I'm like Isaac, and I would be the kind of person who would go and build another well, right? Then I'm going to get run over. I'm going to get used and abused. And you may think, no, I shouldn't think that way. I shouldn't judge them. But Jesus says that's going to happen, right? If somebody compels you to go 1 mile, what do? You go with them too, which means as a Christian, you should expect what? Sometimes you're going to have to walk 2 miles. If somebody slaps you in the face, do what? Turn the other cheek, which you should expect as a Christian. What's going to happen? You're going to get double slapped, sore cheeks. That's exactly right. And so sometimes we do get run over, and we got to be willing to accept that, right? That's what Jesus accepted when he had to go to the cross. Huh? Yeah, and really forgive, right? That's absolutely true. So I do want you to appreciate, though, we sit here and we talk about in our time, in our day, how hard it is to shine, how hard it is to be truly different, right? And not just kind of different, right? Not just, I go to church on Sunday different, but really, genuinely different. But I do want you to think about how much easier we have it than somebody like Abraham or Isaac or Jacob or Joseph. We sit here and we talk about how hard it is to be different and that we sometimes stand out and that makes us feel uncomfortable. Well, I mean, when we meet Abraham in heaven, what's he going to say about that, really? I mean, how much harder must it have been for him than it would have been for us, than it is for us? How much harder is it for Joseph, who's in Potiphar's house, who is sold into slavery, who's left his family, who's in this pagan culture, who knows nobody, has no church family, has no family, and yet still maintains his integrity in the spite of everything? How much harder it would have been for them to shine. How much easier it would have been for them to sink back into their culture and just do whatever doesn't make waves. And I would challenge you the next time that you're tempted to not be like salt, the next time you're tempted to cover up your light, to remember how hard it must have been for these men who were princes of God in the place where they lived. How hard it would have been for them to shine, and yet they still did. So please consider that. And please seek in whatever way you can to shine in your life. That is something these great fathers of faith teach us about walking with God. All right, I have 1 minute left. Here we go. I forgot to click this, but next class, oh, what am I doing? Next class, you're not going to read that. Next class, you're going to have Wally Hayes here. And Wally is going to teach on the story of Joseph. So read Genesis 37. Don't read that. Read Genesis 37. All right? Thank you guys for class.